Just a polite goodbye and a mental note. Never date someone who thinks rent pays itself. But there was one exception to Gary's emotional minimalism. His sister Laura and her kids. Cindy, 16, and Charlie, 14, thought Uncle Gary was the coolest human alive. And Gary? He adored them. It wasn't uncommon for him to show up unannounced, kidnap them for a day trip, and return them full of sugar and stories. Museums, roadside attractions, and most importantly, the movies. The three of them had a standing tradition. Popcorn, laughter, and the biggest screen they could find. Today was one of those days. Gary knocked on Laura's door, holding 2 movie tickets like golden keys. "Tell me you're not busy," he said when Cindy opened the door, her hair in a messy bun and her phone glued to her hand. "Uncle Gary," she squealed, abandoning her phone like it had personally offended her. "Charlie." Movie day. Charlie appeared from the hallway, wearing a hoodie that looked like it had survived a small war. "What are we watching?" Gary grinned. "Something with explosions, and probably a car chase. I figured we'd keep it classy." Laura emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "Gary, you can't keep spoiling them." "Sure I can," Gary said, breezing past her into the living room. "It's in the Cool Uncle Handbook. Page 3. Right after teach them how to burp the alphabet." Laura rolled her eyes but smiled. "Just don't let them talk you into buying half the concession stand." "Half? Please, we're going for full ownership." The theater smelled like butter and nostalgia. Gary handed Cindy and Charlie their snacks, popcorn buckets the size of small bathtubs and sodas that could double as free weights. They settled into their seats, the lights dimmed, and Gary felt that familiar warmth. Not from the movie, but from the laughter bubbling beside him. Cindy's giggles, Charlie's whispered commentary. It was chaos, but it was his kind of chaos. Halfway through the film, Gary's phone buzzed. A work email. He ignored it. For 2 hours, he wasn't Gary the CAD professional. He was Gary the adventurer, the guy who made ordinary days extraordinary. As the credits rolled, Cindy stretched dramatically. "Best movie ever." "You say that every time," Gary teased. "Because it's always true," she shot back. Charlie nudged Gary. "Next time, can we do something weird? Like, I dunno, a haunted house?" Gary raised an eyebrow. "In January?" "Exactly," Charlie said, grinning. "Extra creepy." Gary laughed, slinging an arm around both kids as they walked out. "Deal. Haunted house, coming soon. But first, ice cream." Because that was Gary Turner. Calm, collected, and maybe, just maybe, ready for something unexpected. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Invitation. Gary Turner wasn't the kind of man who made plans weeks in advance. His calendar was a minimalist masterpiece, mostly work deadlines and the occasional dentist appointment. So when Cindy texted him 2 days later with, "Uncle Gary, you have to come to the Retro Film Festival this weekend. It's mandatory, non-negotiable." He stared at his phone like it had just insulted his intelligence. Retro Film Festival? Gary's idea of nostalgia was watching old action flicks on streaming, not sitting in a theater full of people who probably quoted lines from movies older than his car. He typed back, "Mandatory? Pretty sure you don't have jurisdiction over my weekends." Seconds later, his phone buzzed again. "Charlie says you're scared of black and white movies." Gary smirked. "Tell Charlie I fear nothing. Except maybe musicals." Another ping. "There's free popcorn." Gary sighed. They knew his weaknesses. He stared at the CAD model glowing on his monitor. A sleek design for a client who wanted everything yesterday, and felt the familiar tug. Work could wait. Life couldn't. He grabbed his jacket. The festival was held in a refurbished theater downtown, the kind with velvet curtains and chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a Victorian novel. Gary parked his car and spotted Cindy and Charlie near the entrance, both dressed like they'd raided a thrift store for vintage chic. Cindy wore a polka dot dress and cat eye sunglasses, while Charlie sported suspenders and a fedora that made him look like a pint-sized detective. "You two look like you time traveled," Gary said, walking up. "That's the point," Cindy replied, striking a pose. "You're underdressed." Gary glanced at his jeans and jacket. "I call this modern man who was tricked into attending." Charlie grinned. "You'll thank us later." Inside, the theater buzzed with energy. People milled about, clutching programs and debating which classic film deserved the title of greatest ever. Gary scanned the crowd, amused by the sheer enthusiasm. He was about to make a sarcastic comment when Cindy tugged his sleeve. "Uncle Gary, meet Sophie," she said, pulling him toward a woman standing near the concession stand. Gary turned and froze. Sophie was unexpected. She wore a vintage band tee knotted at the waist, paired with jeans and boots that looked like they'd seen a few adventures. Her hair was a cascade of auburn waves, and her smile, wide, genuine, hit Gary like a well-aimed punchline. She was laughing at something Cindy had said, and when her eyes met Gary's, they sparkled with mischief. "Hi," Sophie said, offering a hand. "You must be the famous Uncle Gary." Gary shook her hand, trying not to overthink the warmth of her grip. "Famous? I think you mean infamous." Sophie laughed. "Cindy talks about you all the time. The cool uncle who kidnaps them for adventures." Gary shot Cindy a look. "You've been leaking classified information." "Relax," Cindy said, grinning. I only told her the good stuff. Sophie tilted her head. So, are you a film buff? Or did they drag you here against your will? Gary smirked. Let's just say I was promised free popcorn. Ah, bribery. Classic tactic. Sophie's eyes danced. Well, you're in luck. Tonight's feature is Roman Holiday. Ever seen it? Gary hesitated. Does it have explosions? Sophie laughed. A rich, unguarded sound that made Gary's chest feel oddly light. No explosions. But there's a scooter chase through Rome. That's something. Gary shrugged. Close enough. They ended up sitting together. Cindy and Charlie conveniently disappearing into the row behind them with smug grins. Gary tried to focus on the movie, but Sophie's presence was distracting in the best possible way. She whispered witty commentary during the slow parts, her voice low and conspiratorial, and Gary found himself laughing more than he expected. When Audrey Hepburn zipped through Rome on that scooter, Sophie leaned over and said, "See, action sequence." Gary grinned. "I'll allow it." By the time the credits rolled, Gary realized something unusual. He didn't want the night to end. And judging by Sophie's smile as they walked out, she didn't either. So, she said, adjusting her jacket, next weekend they're showing Casablanca. You in? Gary opened his mouth, ready with a joke, but what came out surprised even him. Yeah, I'm in. Sophie's smile widened. Good. It's a date. Gary blinked. A date? He hadn't been on one in years. But as Cindy and Charlie flanked him, grinning like they'd orchestrated the whole thing, Gary felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Forward momentum. Chapter 3. Enter the leading lady. Gary Turner had never been the type to overthink a casual promise. But as Saturday crept closer, the words, "It's a date," replayed in his head like a song stuck on repeat. He wasn't sure if Sophie had meant it literally or as a throwaway line, but either way, Gary found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, worrying about what to wear. His closet wasn't exactly a fashion wonderland. It was a neat lineup of button-downs, polos, and jeans, functional, predictable, safe. Gary stared at the options, hands on his hips, and muttered, "You're overthinking this." Still, he picked the least boring shirt he owned, a navy button-down that made his eyes look less tired, and paired it with dark jeans. Casual but not careless. That was the goal. The theater lobby was buzzing when Gary arrived. Posters of classic films lined the walls, and a jazz trio played softly in the corner, giving the place an old Hollywood vibe. Gary scanned the crowd, feeling oddly nervous, until he spotted her. Sophie was leaning against the concession counter, chatting with the guy behind it like they were old friends. She wore a leather jacket over a simple white tee, her auburn hair pulled into a loose braid that somehow looked effortless and intentional at the same time. When she saw Gary, her face lit up with a smile that made his pulse skip. "You made it," she said, walking toward him. "And look at you, Mr. Navy Button-Down. Very Cary Grant." Gary chuckled. "I was going for guy who owns more than one shirt." "Well, mission accomplished." Sophie grinned. "Ready for Casablanca?" Gary shrugged. "As ready as I'll ever be. I even Googled the plot so I wouldn't look clueless." Sophie laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "Spoiler alert, they don't blow up anything." "Tragic," Gary deadpanned. "I was hoping for at least one explosion." They found their seats, and as the lights dimmed, Gary felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Sophie had that effect, like gravity, pulling him out of his own head. She whispered commentary during the opening credits, her voice low and teasing. "Fun fact," she murmured, leaning closer. "Humphrey Bogart was shorter than Ingrid Bergman. They had to use boxes and camera tricks." Gary smirked. "So Hollywood was lying to us even back then." "Always," Sophie said, her lips curving into a smile. As the film unfolded, Gary found himself watching Sophie almost as much as the screen. She laughed at the dry one-liners, sighed at the romantic tension, and at one point, wiped a tear discreetly when Ilsa said goodbye. Gary pretended not to notice, but something about that small gesture tugged at him. When the credits rolled, Sophie stretched and turned to him. "So? Verdict?" Gary tilted his head. "Not bad. No explosions, but the dialogue was sharp." Sophie grinned. High praise from Mr. Action Flick. They walked out into the cool night air, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the sidewalk. Gary shoved his hands into his pockets, feeling strangely reluctant to say goodbye. "So," Sophie said, glancing at him, "there's a diner around the corner. Best pie in town. Want to grab a slice?" Gary hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Pie sounds good." The diner was a time capsule of chrome and neon, with red vinyl booths and a jukebox humming softly in the corner. They slid into a booth and Sophie ordered cherry pie without even looking at the menu. "Trust me," she said. "It's life-changing." Gary raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold claim for pie." "You'll see." Sophie smiled, then rested her chin on her hand. "So, Gary Turner, tell me something about yourself that isn't boring." Gary smirked. "Define boring." "Anything that sounds like a LinkedIn profile," Sophie said, eyes twinkling. Gary thought for a moment. "Okay, I once drove 3 hours out of my way just to see the world's largest ball of twine." Sophie blinked. then laughed so hard the waitress gave her a curious look. That's oddly impressive. Gary shrugged. What can I say? I like weird adventures. Sophie leaned in, her smile softening. Me too. The waitress arrived with 2 plates of pie, and as Sophie took the first bite, she closed her eyes like she was savoring a masterpiece. Gary watched her, amused and maybe a little captivated. Okay, she said, pointing her fork at him. Your turn. Try it. Gary took a bite. Sweet, tart, perfect. He nodded slowly. Not bad. Not bad. Sophie gasped. That's all you've got? Gary grinned. Fine. It's life-changing. Sophie laughed again, and Gary felt something shift, something small but undeniable. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about work or past relationships or what came next. He was just here, in this booth, with a woman who made him laugh like it was easy. And that felt like the start of something. Chapter 4? Sparks and Sarcasm. Gary Turner wasn't sure what surprised him more. That Sophie had texted him midweek, or that he'd smiled like an idiot when he saw her name pop up on his phone. Hey, Mr. Action Flick. There's a coffee shop near the theater that does trivia nights. Thursday. You in? Gary stared at the message, thumb hovering over the screen. Trivia night? He wasn't exactly a walking encyclopedia of random facts. But the idea of seeing Sophie again, without the buffer of Cindy and Charlie, was enough to make him type back, only if the questions involve explosions. Her reply came seconds later. No promises, but I'll buy you a latte if you lose. Gary grinned. Prepare to spend money. The coffee shop was the kind of place that tried hard to look effortless. Exposed brick walls, mismatched chairs, and Edison bulbs dangling like ideas that hadn't quite landed. Gary walked in and spotted Sophie immediately. She was at a corner table, flipping through a trivia booklet, her braid undone so her hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders. She looked up and that smile, the one that made Gary feel like the room had better lighting, appeared instantly. You came, she said, standing to greet him. You promised coffee, Gary replied, sliding into the chair across from her. I'm a man of simple motivations. Sophie smirked. Good to know. So, how's your week? Saved the world with CAD designs. Gary chuckled. Not exactly. Unless you count preventing a client from insisting their building should look like a spaceship. Sophie laughed, eyes crinkling at the corners. I'd pay to see that. Gary leaned back, relaxing into the rhythm of her humor. What about you? Any heroic deeds? Just the usual, Sophie said, waving a hand. Work, errands, convincing my neighbor not to name their cat Chairman Meow. Gary grinned. That's a public service. The trivia host, a guy in suspenders and a bow tie who looked like he'd been born for this, kicked off the game. Sophie and Gary teamed up, their table littered with answer sheets and coffee cups. The questions ranged from classic literature to obscure geography, and Gary quickly realized Sophie was a force of nature. Capital of Bhutan? She whispered. Gary blinked. Is that a real place? Sophie stifled a laugh. Thimphu. Trust me. Later, when a question about 1940s cinema popped up, Gary leaned in. Finally, my moment. Sophie raised an eyebrow. You know this one? Gary smirked. Humphrey Bogart. Casablanca. Boom. Sophie grinned. Look at you, Mr. Classic Film. Gary shrugged. I had a good teacher. Her smile lingered longer than necessary, and Gary felt that subtle shift again, the one that made the air feel charged, like static before a storm. By the end of the night, they'd placed second. Sophie insisted on celebrating anyway, dragging Gary to the dessert counter for a slice of chocolate cake. You earned this, she said, handing him a fork. Gary eyed the cake. Pretty sure you answered 90% of the questions. Team effort, Sophie said, her tone teasing. Besides, you nailed Bogart. Gary smirked. That sounds like a weird compliment. Sophie laughed, and Gary found himself laughing too. Really laughing, the kind that loosened something inside him he hadn't realized was tight. They lingered long after the game ended, talking about everything and nothing. Favorite movies, worst jobs, the time Sophie accidentally dyed her hair green in college. Gary told her about the twine ball adventure, and she nearly choked on her coffee. You're ridiculous, she said, eyes shining. Ridiculously charming, Gary corrected. Sophie tilted her head, pretending to consider. Debatable. Gary grinned. I'll take debatable. When they finally stepped outside, the night was cool and quiet, the street lamps casting soft halos on the pavement. Sophie zipped her jacket and looked at him, her expression warm but unreadable. This was fun, she said. Yeah, Gary replied, shoving his hands into his pockets. We should do it again. Sophie smiled. We should. And just like that, Gary felt it. The spark, the momentum, the sense that something was unfolding, slow and steady, like a story he didn't want to put down. Chapter 5. Laura's interference. Gary Turner had always been predictable in the best possible way. He showed up for family dinners on time, never forgot birthdays, and could be counted on to rescue Laura from any DIY disaster with his CAD precision and calm demeanor. So when Laura noticed something different, something subtle but undeniable, she decided it was her sisterly duty to investigate. It started with the smile. Gary had come over for Sunday lunch, and while he was his usual dry-humored self, There was a lightness about him, a flicker in his eyes when his phone buzzed. Laura caught it immediately. She was a mother of 2 teenagers. She could spot a secret at 50 paces. "Who's texting you?" she asked casually, spooning mashed potatoes onto Charlie's plate. Gary didn't look up from his phone. "Work." Laura narrowed her eyes. "Work doesn't make you grin like that." Gary slid the phone into his pocket, expression neutral. "You're imagining things." Cindy perked up, sensing drama like a bloodhound. "He's totally hiding something." "Eat your vegetables," Gary said, pointing his fork at her. Laura smirked. "You know, Gary, it's been a while since you dated." Gary sighed. "Here we go." "I'm just saying," Laura continued, ignoring his groan. "You're 35, handsome, gainfully employed, and you're smiling at your phone like a teenager. So spill." Gary stabbed a piece of roast beef with unnecessary force. "There's nothing to spill." Cindy leaned forward, eyes wide. "Is it someone from work?" "No," Gary said firmly. Charlie grinned. "Someone from the gym?" "I don't go to the gym." Laura crossed her arms, her detective instincts kicking in. "Then who?" Gary hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Laura to pounce. "Oh my God," she said, eyes widening. "You met someone." Gary set down his fork, resigned. "Laura, don't Laura me," she said, practically vibrating with excitement. "What's her name? Where did you meet? Is she normal? Please tell me she's normal." Gary rubbed his temples. "Her name's Sophie. We met at a film festival." Cindy gasped. "That's so romantic." Gary shot her a look. It was a retro movie night, not a Nicholas Sparks novel. Laura ignored him, already plotting. Okay, Sophie. Cute name. What does she do? Is she nice? Does she like kids?" Gary groaned. "Laura? Does she like pie?" Cindy added helpfully. Gary blinked. "Why would that matter?" "Because everyone likes pie," Cindy said, as if it were a universal truth. Laura leaned in, eyes gleaming. "Gary, this is huge. You haven't dated in years. You need to bring her over." Gary stared at her. "Absolutely not." Laura grinned. "Oh, you will. I'll make lasagna." Gary shook his head, muttering something about boundaries, but Laura was already in full metal mode. She spent the rest of lunch dropping hints about family dinners, game nights, and how Sophie would love to meet us. Cindy and Charlie chimed in with their own ideas, including a group outing to an escape room. By the time Gary left, he felt like he'd survived a tactical interrogation. And yet, as he drove home, he couldn't help smiling, because Sophie had texted him again. "Next weekend. Outdoor market. You in?" Gary typed back before he could overthink it. "Absolutely." And just like that, Laura's meddling was the least of his worries, because Gary Turner, the man who lived by logic and calm, was starting to feel something wildly unpredictable. Chapter 6. The Disaster Date. Gary Turner prided himself on being prepared. He was the guy who carried a spare phone charger, who checked the weather before leaving the house, who never ran out of gas. So when Sophie suggested dinner at a trendy new bistro downtown, Gary thought, easy. I've got this. He did not, in fact, have this. The trouble started with the reservation. Gary had booked online, double-checked the confirmation, and even arrived 10 minutes early. But when he gave his name to the hostess, a woman with a smile sharp enough to slice bread, she frowned at the screen. "I'm sorry," she said, tapping the tablet. "We don't have a reservation under Turner." Gary blinked. "I booked it yesterday." She tilted her head sympathetically, the way people do when they're about to ruin your evening. "We're fully booked tonight." Gary felt his calm crack. "Could you check again?" She checked. Still nothing. Gary stepped aside, pulled out his phone, and opened the confirmation email. There it was, clear as day. Reservation for 2, Thursday, 7 p.m. Except, Thursday was next week. Gary stared at the date like it had personally betrayed him. Perfect. Just perfect. Sophie arrived moments later, looking effortlessly stunning in a simple black dress and boots. Her smile lit up the sidewalk, until Gary broke the news. "So," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "funny story." Sophie listened, then laughed. A bright, unguarded laugh that made Gary's embarrassment feel slightly less catastrophic. "Well," she said, looping her arm through his. "Guess we're improvising." Gary exhaled. "You're taking this way better than I expected." "Gary," Sophie said, grinning, "if a date goes perfectly, it's boring. Let's find somewhere else." They wandered down the street, scanning for options. The first place they tried had a 2-hour wait. The second was hosting a private event. The third smelled like someone had set fire to garlic bread. Finally, they stumbled upon a tiny diner with flickering neon and a sign that read best burgers in town. Sophie shot him a look. "Burgers?" she asked. Gary shrugged. "When in doubt, go classic." The diner was half empty, the air thick with the scent of fries and nostalgia. They slid into a booth, and Gary tried to shake off the sense that the universe was testing him. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed perfectly content, scanning the menu like it was a treasure map. "Okay," she said. "What's your go-to burger?" Gary smirked. "Plain. No frills." Sophie gasped theatrically. Gary Turner, you're a monster. Gary chuckled. What's yours? Everything, Sophie said, eyes gleaming. Bacon, avocado, jalapenos. If it doesn't look like a structural hazard, I'm not interested. Gary grinned. Noted. The food arrived, and for a moment, things seemed back on track, until Gary reached for his soda and knocked it over. The glass tipped, sending cola cascading across the table and onto Sophie's lap. Oh no, Gary muttered, grabbing napkins like a man possessed. I'm so sorry. Sophie laughed, dabbing at her dress. Relax. It's just soda. Gary froze mid-blot. You're really okay with this? Gary, Sophie said, smiling. If this is the worst thing that happens tonight, we're doing great. Gary stared at her, napkin in hand, and felt something shift. She wasn't flustered, wasn't annoyed. She was laughing, like chaos was just part of the adventure. And for the first time in his life, Gary realized he kind of liked chaos. They finished their meal, swapped stories about childhood disasters, and by the time they stepped outside, Gary was grinning like a fool. So, Sophie said, pulling her jacket tight against the cool night air. Next time, maybe double-check the date? Gary chuckled. Next time, I'm hiring a personal assistant. Sophie smirked. Or you could just let me handle the reservations. Gary grinned. Deal. And as they walked toward the parking lot, Gary thought about how everything had gone wrong, and somehow everything had gone right. Chapter 7. Gary's vulnerability. Gary Turner wasn't used to quiet moments feeling this loud. He and Sophie were sitting on a park bench overlooking the river, the city lights shimmering on the water like scattered stars. The outdoor market had been a whirlwind. Vendors shouting, music playing, Sophie dragging him from booth to booth like a kid in a candy store. She'd bought a jar of artisanal honey, a pair of earrings shaped like tiny cameras, and a loaf of bread so crusty it could double as a weapon. Gary had bought nothing, but he'd laughed more than he had in months. Now, the market had closed, the crowd had thinned, and the night had settled into something softer. Sophie leaned back against the bench, her braid loose, her jacket unzipped, her smile easy. This was fun, she said, gazing at the water. I needed this. Gary nodded. Me too. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Not awkward, but weighted, like the pause before a confession. Sophie turned to him, her expression curious. So, she said, what's your story, Gary Turner? Gary smirked. Pretty sure you know my story. Cat guy. Cool uncle. Occasional trivia loser. Sophie smiled. That's the surface. I mean the real story. Gary hesitated. He wasn't the type to spill his guts on a park bench. But something about Sophie, the way she asked without pushing, the way she listened like it mattered, made him want to try. I've only been in 2 relationships, he said finally. Since high school. Sophie blinked. 2? That's rare. Gary shrugged. First one ended because of distance. We were young. She moved for a job, and neither of us wanted the long-distance thing. No drama. Just goodbye. And the second? Sophie asked gently. Gary exhaled, staring at the rippling water. She decided she wanted to quit her career and be a stay-at-home girlfriend. Still had student loans. Couldn't do it. I'm not built for that kind of imbalance. Sophie was quiet for a beat, then nodded. Makes sense. Gary glanced at her. You don't think that makes me cold? Sophie tilted her head, her eyes steady. No, it makes you honest. And honestly, that's rare. Gary felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized was there. What about you? He asked. Your story. Sophie smiled wryly. 3 relationships. 1 high school sweetheart who thought forever meant 6 months. 1 college boyfriend who cheated on me with his lab partner. And 1 guy who decided he wanted to find himself in Bali. Spoiler alert, he found someone else instead. Gary winced. Ouch. Sophie shrugged. It happens. I learned a lot though. Like what? Gary asked. Like, Sophie said, her smile softening. I'd rather be alone than with someone who doesn't know what they want. Gary nodded slowly. Yeah, I get that. For a moment, they just sat there, the night humming around them. Gary felt the weight of her words, the honesty in them, and something inside him shifted, something quiet but undeniable. He wasn't sure what this was yet, this thing between them, but he knew one thing he wanted to find out. Sophie stood, brushing crumbs from her jeans. Come on, she said, grinning. I'm walking you to your car. Gary rose, falling into step beside her. And as they walked through the quiet streets, Gary realized something strange. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what could go wrong. He was thinking about what could go right. Chapter 8. The Big Misunderstanding. Gary Turner had never considered himself a man prone to drama. He liked things simple, clean lines, clear plans, no surprises. But Sophie? Sophie was a walking surprise, and Gary was starting to think he liked that about her. Until Thursday. It started innocently enough. Gary was at his desk, reviewing a CAD model for a client who wanted a building shaped like a seashell, because apparently practicality was optional in architecture, when his phone buzzed. A text from Sophie. Hey, can we rain check Saturday? Something came up. Gary stared at the message, his stomach sinking. Saturday was supposed to be their next adventure. A day trip to the botanical garden Sophie had been raving about. He typed back, "Sure. Everything okay?" Her reply was quick. "Yeah, just plans changed. I'll explain later." Gary frowned. Plans changed. That was vague. Too vague. He told himself not to overthink it, but by the time he left work, his brain had staged a full-scale mutiny. The next day, Gary swung by Laura's house to drop off a book Charlie needed for school. He barely made it through the door before Laura pounced. "So," she said, eyes gleaming, "how's Sophie?" Gary hesitated. "Fine, I guess." Laura tilted her head. "You guess." "She canceled our plans," Gary said, trying to sound casual. "Said something came up." Laura gasped like he'd announced a national emergency. "Gary, that's bad." Gary sighed. "Or it's nothing." "Or," Laura said, lowering her voice dramatically, "she's losing interest." Gary groaned. "Laura? I'm just saying," Laura continued, ignoring his protest. "Women don't cancel unless there's a reason." Gary rubbed his temples. "She said she'd explain later." Laura crossed her arms. Later could mean never. Gary left before Laura could draft a conspiracy theory involving Sophie and a secret yacht. But her words stuck like burrs in his mind. By Saturday afternoon, Gary was restless. He tried working, but every CD line blurred into Sophie's smile. Finally, he gave in and texted her, "Hope everything's okay." No response. Hours passed. Still nothing. Gary told himself not to spiral. People got busy. Phones died. Life happened. But when he opened social media that evening, something he rarely did, he saw it. A photo. Sophie at a rooftop bar, laughing with a guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a cologne ad. The caption read, "Celebrating big news." Gary stared at the screen, his chest tightening. Big news? Rooftop bar? Guy with jawline sharp enough to cut glass? Gary felt something he hadn't felt in years, jealousy. Ugly, irrational, and loud. He closed the app, tossed his phone on the couch, and muttered, "Well, that explains it." When Sophie finally texted the next morning, "Sorry for the delay. Can we talk later?" Gary's reply was short. "Sure." No smiley face. No joke. Just sure. Because Gary Turner, the man who prided himself on calm, was anything but calm. And for the first time since he'd met Sophie, he wondered if the story was about to end before it really began. Chapter 9. The kids saved the day. Gary Turner was sulking. He wouldn't have admitted it out loud. He'd have called it processing or taking time to think. But the truth was he was sulking. His Saturday had been a blur of city files and coffee, punctuated by the occasional glance at his phone, which remained stubbornly silent except for Sophie's vague, "Can we talk later?" Talk later. Translation. Goodbye, Gary. At least that's what his brain kept insisting. So when Laura called Sunday afternoon and said, "Come over for dinner," Gary almost said no. But then Cindy got on the line. "Uncle Gary," she said, her voice dripping with teenage authority. "You're coming. No excuses." Gary sighed. "Fine." When he walked into Laura's kitchen, Cindy and Charlie were perched at the island like two conspirators plotting a coup. Laura was stirring a pot of sauce, humming like she didn't know her children were up to something, which meant she absolutely knew. "Uncle Gary," Cindy chirped, hopping off her stool. "We need to talk." Gary raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About Sophie," Charlie said, grinning like a cat with a secret. Gary groaned. "Not you too." Cindy crossed her arms. "You like her." Gary opened his mouth, then closed it. "That's irrelevant." Charlie smirked. "You totally do." Gary rubbed his temples. "Guys, she canceled because of something important," Cindy interrupted. "Not because she doesn't like you." Gary frowned. "How do you know that?" Cindy grinned. "Because we asked." Gary blinked. "You what?" Charlie shrugged. "We DM'd her." Gary stared at them, horrified. "You what? Why?" "Relax," Cindy said, waving a hand. "We just said hi. She told us she got a promotion at work and had to go to some last-minute celebration thing." Gary froze. "Promotion?" "Yep," Charlie said, popping a grape into his mouth. "She was celebrating big news. Not big news like dumping Gary." Gary felt heat creep up his neck. "I may have misinterpreted that." Cindy rolled her eyes. "You think?" Gary exhaled, sinking onto a stool. "Okay, fine. Thanks for the intel." But Cindy wasn't done. "You need to fix this." Gary blinked. "Fix what?" "The vibe," Cindy said, like it was obvious. "You probably sounded all cold in your text. You need to do something big." Gary groaned. "Define big." Charlie grinned. "Like, show up at her place with flowers." Gary shook his head. "That's not me." "Then make it you," Cindy said, eyes gleaming. "You like her, right?" Gary hesitated. "Yeah." "Then stop acting like a robot," Cindy said. "Do something romantic." Gary stared at her, then at Charlie, who was nodding like a sage. And for the first time in his life, Gary Turner, the man who planned everything, considered doing something completely unplanned. By the time he left Laura's house, Gary had a plan. Not a CAD perfect, spreadsheet approved plan. A messy, impulsive, terrifying plan. Because Cindy was right. He liked Sophie. And he wasn't about to let a misunderstanding ruin the best thing that had happened to him in years. Chapter 10. The grand gesture. Gary Turner had never been impulsive. His life was a blueprint, straight lines, measured angles, no unnecessary flourishes. But tonight, he was about to throw the blueprint out the window. He stood in the parking lot of Sophie's apartment building, clutching a bouquet of sunflowers. Because roses felt too cliché and daisies felt too timid. Sunflowers were bold, cheerful, optimistic. Everything Gary hoped this moment would be. Beside the flowers was a paper bag containing a slice of cherry pie from the diner where they'd laughed until midnight. And tucked into the bouquet was a handwritten note that read, "I may not know all the answers at trivia night, but I know I don't want to lose this." Gary stared at the note, wondering if it sounded cheesy. Probably did. But Cindy had insisted, girls love handwritten notes. It's like romantic vintage. And Gary figured if he was going to crash Sophie's evening, he might as well go all in. He climbed the stairs, rehearsing what he'd say. "I overreacted. I'm sorry. I like you. A lot. Simple. Honest. No CAD-level precision required." When he reached her door, his heart thudded like a bass drum. He knocked. Footsteps. Then the door opened, and there she was. Sophie looked surprised, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, a glass of wine in hand. She wore a soft gray sweater and jeans, and when her eyes landed on Gary, they widened. "Gary?" she said. "What are you?" "I panicked," Gary blurted, holding out the sunflowers like a shield. "I saw that photo and thought, I don't know what I thought, but it wasn't fair. And I'm sorry." Sophie blinked, then glanced at the flowers. "Sunflowers." Gary nodded. They seemed optimistic. Her lips curved into a smile. "And the pie." Gary held up the bag. "Because you said everyone likes pie." Sophie laughed. A warm, unguarded laugh that made Gary's chest loosen. "Gary, I like you," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "A lot. And I don't want a misunderstanding to ruin that." Sophie stared at him for a long moment, her expression softening. Then she set down her wine, stepped forward, and took the flowers from his hands. "You're ridiculous," she said, smiling. "But in a good way." Gary exhaled, relief washing over him. "So, we're okay?" Sophie grinned. "We're better than okay." And then, before Gary could process what was happening, Sophie leaned in and kissed him, soft, sweet, and full of promise. When she pulled back, Gary was grinning like a fool. "Does this mean I don't have to eat the pie alone?" Sophie laughed. "Come inside, Gary Turner. We've got pie to share." As Gary followed her into the apartment, he thought about how everything had gone wrong, and somehow, everything had gone right. Because sometimes, life wasn't about perfect plans. Sometimes it was about sunflowers, pie, and the courage to show up. Chapter 11. A new adventure. Gary Turner had never thought a text from his niece could feel like a mission briefing. But that's exactly what happened on Saturday morning. "Uncle Gary, we're bored. Fix it. Also, bring Sophie." Gary stared at the message, coffee mug in hand, and chuckled. Cindy didn't ask. She commanded. He typed back, "Define bored." Her reply was instant. "We want an adventure. Something weird. Something fun." Gary grinned. Adventures were his specialty. He glanced at Sophie, who was sitting on his couch, barefoot, sipping tea like she belonged there, which Gary realized she kind of did now. "Cindy wants an adventure," he said. Sophie looked up, eyes sparkling. "What kind?" "The weird kind," Gary said. "You in?" Sophie set down her mug. "Always." An hour later, Gary's SUV was packed with snacks, a questionable GPS route, and two teenagers vibrating with excitement in the back seat. Sophie sat up front, her hair pulled into a messy bun, sunglasses perched on her nose. Gary glanced at her and thought, "This feels right." "Where are we going?" Charlie asked, leaning forward. Gary smirked. "World's largest concrete totem pole." Cindy blinked. "That's oddly specific." Gary shrugged. "You said weird." Sophie laughed. "I love it." The drive was a mix of music, jokes, and Sophie teaching Cindy how to braid her hair in the back seat. Gary kept stealing glances at Sophie, marveling at how easily she fit into this chaos, laughing with the kids, teasing Gary about his questionable playlist, snapping photos of roadside oddities like a pro. When they finally arrived, the totem pole loomed like something out of a surrealist painting, bright colors, strange faces, towering against the Oklahoma sky. Cindy and Charlie bolted out of the car, phones ready for selfies. "This is amazing," Cindy shouted. "It's something," Charlie said, grinning. Gary turned to Sophie. "Worth the drive." Sophie smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Absolutely." They wandered the site, reading plaques, making up stories about the carved faces, and laughing until their sides hurt. At one point, Sophie snapped a photo of Gary standing next to the totem pole, arms crossed like a reluctant tourist. "Smile," she said. Gary smirked. "This is my smile." Sophie rolled her eyes, then stepped closer, looping her arm through his. "Fine." I'll fix it. She kissed his cheek. Quick, playful, but enough to make Gary's heart do a somersault. Cindy caught it on camera and immediately yelled, I'm sending this to Mom. Gary groaned. Great, Laura's going to frame it. Sophie laughed, and Gary thought, let her frame it. I don't care. On the drive back, the kids dozed off in the back seat, their phones full of photos and their heads full of stories. Sophie leaned against the window, her hand resting lightly on Gary's arm. This was perfect, she said softly. Gary glanced at her, his chest warm. Yeah, it was. And as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Gary realized something simple and undeniable. This wasn't just an adventure. It was the beginning of a life he hadn't dared imagine. Chapter 12. Family approval. Gary Turner had faced high-pressure situations before. Tight deadlines, demanding clients, CAD models that refused to cooperate, but nothing compared to the pressure of walking into Laura's house with Sophie at his side. Laura had insisted on hosting dinner the moment she learned Sophie existed. It's just lasagna, she'd said, which Gary knew was code for interrogation with carbs. Cindy and Charlie had been buzzing about it all week, sending Gary texts like, don't embarrass yourself, and wear something nice. Now, as Gary parked in front of Laura's house, Sophie glanced at him with a teasing smile. You look nervous. Gary adjusted his collar. I'm not nervous, Sophie grinned. You're gripping the steering wheel like it owes you money. Gary exhaled, forcing his hands to relax. Okay, maybe a little nervous. Sophie reached over and squeezed his arm. Relax. I'm great with families, Gary muttered. That's what worries me. The door flew open before they could knock. Cindy stood there, practically vibrating with excitement. Sophie, she squealed, ignoring Gary entirely as she hugged Sophie like a long-lost friend. Hi, Sophie said, laughing as Cindy dragged her inside. Wow, you're strong for 16. Charlie appeared next, offering a fist bump. Welcome to the chaos. Gary followed, feeling like a guest at his own family gathering. Laura emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, her smile wide and just a little too bright. Sophie, Laura said warmly, pulling her into a hug. Finally, I've heard so much about you. Gary groaned. Laura waved him off. Gary, go sit. Sophie, come tell me everything. Gary watched helplessly as Sophie was whisked into the kitchen, laughing as Laura peppered her with questions. Cindy and Charlie flanked Gary like bodyguards. She's awesome, Cindy whispered. Charlie nodded. Way cooler than you. Gary smirked. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Dinner was a circus of conversation. Laura asked Sophie about her job, her hobbies, her favorite movies. Cindy quizzed her on music taste. Charlie wanted to know if she liked escape rooms. Sophie handled it all like a pro. Charming, funny, completely at ease. When Laura brought out dessert, she leaned across the table, eyes twinkling. So, Sophie, what do you see in my brother? Gary nearly choked on his water. Laura. Sophie smiled, unflustered. He makes me laugh. He listens. And he's surprisingly adventurous. Gary blinked. Surprisingly? Sophie grinned. World's largest concrete totem pole? That's bold. Cindy laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. Told you that was legendary. Laura softened, her meddling instincts giving way to something gentler. Well, she said, smiling at Gary, I'm glad you found someone who gets you. Gary felt his chest warm. Me too. Later, as they said their goodbyes, Laura hugged Sophie and whispered something Gary couldn't hear. When Sophie returned to his side, she was smiling. What did she say? Gary asked as they walked to the car. Sophie slipped her hand into his. She said, don't let him overthink this. Gary chuckled. Sounds like Laura. Sophie squeezed his hand. Don't worry, I won't let you. And as they drove away, Gary realized something simple and undeniable. This wasn't just about him and Sophie anymore. It was about family, about laughter, about a life that suddenly felt bigger and better than he'd ever imagined. Chapter 13. Happily Ever After with a twist. Gary Turner had never imagined his life would look like this. Standing in line at a roadside ice cream stand, holding Sophie's hand, while Cindy and Charlie argued over whether sprinkles were essential or a crime against dessert. It was chaotic, loud, and completely perfect. The past few weeks had been a blur of adventures, farmers markets, trivia nights, spontaneous drives to places that sounded made up but weren't. Gary had learned two things. Sophie had an uncanny ability to make ordinary moments extraordinary, and he was no longer the man who played life safe. He was the man who showed up with sunflowers and pie. The man who laughed until his stomach hurt. The man who, for the first time in years, felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Uncle Gary, Cindy said, tugging his sleeve as they waited for their cones. You and Sophie are like, disgustingly cute. Gary smirked. Disgustingly? Yeah, Charlie chimed in. Like rom-com cute. It's weird. Sophie laughed, squeezing Gary's hand. I'll take that as a compliment. Gary grinned. Me too. Cindy tilted her head, eyes gleaming with mischief. So, when's the wedding? Gary choked on air. What? Charlie smirked. You heard her. Gary stared at them, then at Sophie, who was laughing so hard she nearly dropped her sunglasses. Ignore them, she said, still grinning. They've been watching too many movies. Gary shook his head, muttering, I blame Laura. They got their ice cream. Gary's plain vanilla, Sophie's towering concoction of chocolate, caramel, and pretzels, and found a picnic table under a string of fairy lights. The kids launched into a debate about the best Marvel movie, leaving Gary and Sophie in their own little bubble. This is nice, Sophie said, licking a drip of chocolate from her cone. Gary nodded. Yeah, it is. She glanced at him, her smile softening. You know, when I met you at that film festival, I didn't expect this. Gary chuckled. Neither did I. Sophie tilted her head. You're full of surprises, Gary Turner. Gary smirked. You have no idea. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Oh. Gary reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Sophie blinked, curious, as he handed it to her. What's this? She asked. Open it, Gary said, trying, and failing, to hide his grin. Sophie tore it open and pulled out 2 tickets. Her eyes widened. A trip to Chicago? Gary nodded. Weekend getaway. Architecture tour. Thought you might like to see what I actually do. Sophie laughed, her eyes shining. Gary, this is amazing. Gary shrugged, suddenly feeling shy. Figured it was time for a new adventure. Sophie leaned over and kissed him. Quick, sweet, and full of promise. You're ridiculous, she whispered. But in the best way. Gary grinned. I'll take that. As Cindy and Charlie launched into yet another debate, this time about whether Thor could beat Iron Man, Gary looked at Sophie and thought about how far he'd come. From a man who lived by blueprints to a man who embraced the messy, beautiful unpredictability of life. And for the first time in years, Gary Turner didn't just feel calm. He felt happy. Really, truly happy.